عندي 106 سنين 106 سنين الحمد لله.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Meet Us on the Abraham Path. I'm Anissa Mehdi, Executive Director of the Abraham Path Initiative. API is a nonprofit organization dedicated to building bridges of global connection with this part of the world, the Middle East, Southwest Asia, a region known more for conflict and hostility than for its hospitable people and spectacular walking trails. API's mission is to spotlight the enduring traditions of hospitality in Southwest Asia. How do we do that? Through walking, originally, and now, of course, through showing, exploring, and inquiring online. Since 2007, we've worked with local partners to build over 2,000 miles of walking trail in the region. So visitors may walk from place to place and meet with regular folks and stay overnight in their homes. It's an immersion into authentic hospitality. These visits transform the visitors and, importantly, bring economic benefit to the off-the-beaten-path communities that we walk through. The hosts, tour guides, and travelers foster friendships across the challenging divides of our times. Nowadays, we're also building pathways and fostering friendships through cyberspace. And here you are with us today from Dusseldorf, Jerusalem, Kampala, London, Madison, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, Sao Paulo, and elsewhere. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are sailing the Dead Sea. I've always wanted to see how to get across the Dead Sea. It's wonderful to float there. But we have with us an expert who can tell us about the historical use of the Dead Sea, literally, to transport goods. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph A. Greene. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Anissa.
Joe is the former deputy director and curator of the Museum of the Ancient Near East at Harvard University. Now, Joe, you got a PhD in archaeology from the Oriental Institute of University of Chicago. You've worked in the field on excavations for years. You've worked in Tunisia and Cyprus and Jordan. You're a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow. How exciting your career has been.
Well, no doubt about that. I have had lots of opportunities to see that part of the world that most interests me and to find out more about its past, both recent and distant.
Now, I thought I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was a kid. We had archaeology in 6th grade, and it was just fascinating. My heart said, that's me, at 11 years old. And in the end, I studied Spanish and ended up in broadcast journalism. But I'm curious what propelled you to go all the way to your doctorate and to real archaeological digs.
Well, I hadn't contemplated archaeology specifically. I had an opportunity to go on an excavation. I said, this is interesting. Because it combined my sort of interests in the past and the intellectual study of it with being outdoors. So it was for me, it was a perfect combination of experience, and that hasn't changed.
Very good. Now, I'm also curious, after spending all that time on location, did you not find museum work a little bit confining?
Well, I found that there were a lot of advantages to working in a museum, partly because all the stuff was there. You didn't have to go out and get it. And quite frankly, there are plenty of things in museum collections that need further study. So we don't need to dig up more stuff. We need to study the stuff we already have. It also confronted me with material culture from disparate parts of the ancient Mediterranean, Near Eastern world that I had not necessarily studied closely. So required actually an ongoing education in what it was we had in our collections. It also enabled me to communicate on a regular basis with specialist colleagues in this particular area, that particular area, that I was able then to say, well, exactly what does this inscription say, or exactly how is that word used to describe this object? So it was by no means confining.
I hear that. Wonderful. And among some of the follow-up work that you did is part of what you're going to be leading us through today?
Well, the topic is somewhat offbeat, but being, as I say, attracted to a variety of things across the ancient world, it enabled me to actually put these things together in a coherent way.
Well, we're ready to hear it.
All right.
Take us sailing the Dead Sea.
So the Jordan Valley, the Dead Sea, and the Wadi Araba form an emphatic physical barrier between the Mediterranean Sea and the Syrian desert. Looking at the landscape, it's easy to generalize that physical barrier into all sorts of other barriers, political, economic, social, cultural. And in fact, it has been a barrier for much of my lifetime, certainly for all of that time I've taken a professional, that is to say, archaeological interest in the region. But being an archaeologist, I can take a long-term perspective, the longue durée, as the French historian Fernand Braudel put it. In the courte durée, however, the Jordan Valley, Dead Sea, and the Arava have come to be regarded as barriers demarcating a hard boundary between political states. This was not always so, even as recently as the Ottoman era, but also much earlier. And such unity was not merely political, but also cultural, re-emerging repeatedly after protracted periods of political rupture. Exploring these connections, I think, are very much in the spirit of the Abraham Path. The particular point is that in the past, both recent and distant, the Dead Sea carried boats that connected the highlands on the east and west sides of the Jordan Rift. These connections also occurred on dry land in the north across the Jordan Valley and in the south across the Wadi Araba. But it's the waterborne traffic that's most conceptually arresting and visually striking. By the end of the talk, I think you'll see what I mean. The Dead Sea is the terminal basin of the Jordan River, a narrow, landlocked, hypersaline lake lying below sea level at the southern end of the Syrian Rift Valley. Its name comes from its evident inability to support marine life, but it has over the millennia had other names. Biblical writers called it the Salt Sea, or the Sea of the Arava, or the Eastern Sea, to distinguish it from the Western Sea, the Mediterranean. Modern English translations often render Dead Sea in place of the literal wording. The New Testament lacks any specific reference to the Dead Sea, but earlier Greek texts, Diodorus, Pliny, Josephus, identify it as Lake Asphaltus, since the Dead Sea was, among other things, a source of asphalt, that is bitumen or pitch. The name Dead Sea first occurs in the 2nd century AD travel writer Pausanias as Thalassa Nekra, literally Dead Sea. The Arab geographers from Yaqubi in the 9th century to Idrisi in the 12th called it the same in Arabic, Al-Bakra al-Mayit. In Arabic, it was also the Stinking Sea for its odoriferous mineral springs, the Sea of Zogar for the town at its southeastern shore, which produced sukar, sugar. The Sea of Lot, the Jordan Valley was considered the country of Lot's people, or the Overturned Sea, since it lay in a land that God had overturned, an evocation of the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Dead Sea receives the flow of the Jordan River and its tributaries, a catchment that stretches from the southern slopes of Mount Hermon down the entire Jordan Valley and into the eastern Negev. This includes runoff from seasonal wadis on the west and both seasonal and perennial streams on the east, principally the Wadi Mujib and the Wadi Hassa. Fresh or mineral springs, Ein Gedi and Ein Feshka on the west, Zakra Ma'in on the east, also flow into it. Subterranean mineral springs well up from the seabed. The sea itself lies in the rain shadow of the western highlands, so rainfall is sparse, barely 100 millimeters annually in its northern shore, and less than half that in the south. Now, although the waters feeding it are fresh and brackish, the Dead Sea is far saltier than the oceans, containing 30% dissolved minerals. These are primarily magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, that is potash, and sodium chloride, common salt. The minerals render the Dead Sea oily to the touch, bitter to taste and poisonous to drink. The water's high specific gravity permits humans to float in it unaided, but it supports no marine life, save some infrequent blooms of salt-tolerant algae and bacteria. The Dead Sea's low elevation and underlying geology contribute to its hypersalinity. The seafloor is thickly coated with mineral deposits left by the drying of a succession of prehistoric ocean lagoons and landlocked salt lakes, which previously had flooded the rift. High rates of evaporation, promoted by prevailing extreme aridity and high atmospheric temperatures, further concentrate the dissolved minerals. In the routine 40 degrees centigrade plus of summer heat, higher nowadays because of global warming, rates of evaporation can reach 2.5 centimeters a day or more. Because the Dead Sea has no outlet, it loses water only by evaporation. When the inflow of water outpaces evaporation, sea level rises and the sea expands. When evaporation exceeds inflow, the level sinks and the lake shrinks. The lake has undergone prolonged but erratic cycles of expansion and contraction as regional and global climate alternated between warm, wet periods and cool, dry ones, making the Dead Sea Basin a gigantic rain gauge. Now, changes in Dead Sea level can be inferred from the study of lake sediments, the succession of early exposed shorelines, locations and datings of archaeological sites around the water's edge, historical texts, and early travelers' accounts. We know that from around 10,000 to 2000 BC, levels fluctuated between a high of 290 meters below sea level to a low of 404 below. Less drastic oscillations took place between 2000 BC and the turn of the eras. By the Roman period, the sea had fallen again, exposing a ford across the shallows from the Lisan Peninsula to the western shore just 4 kilometers away. By the end of the Crusades, the level had risen again, closing the Lisan ford. In 1818, British travelers Irby and Mangles reported it was open once again to donkey caravans going from Karak to Hebron. But 30 years later, in 1848, the American explorer Francis Lynch found the Lisan Straits again covered in deep water. The size of the sea, that is the amount of area it covers on the ground, varies with its depths. In recent decades, it has shrunk as the tributaries of the Jordan River have been diverted for agriculture and human consumption. Shallow southern basin has dried out completely, replaced by artificial evaporation pans for the commercial extraction of potash, bromine, and table salt. Near Getty, where the sea had previously been widest, about 18 kilometers, water has retreated over a kilometer eastward. On the opposite shore, where the bottom is deeper, around 400 meters below the surface, the contraction is less perceptible. Now, the same geological processes that form the sea, downfaulting and displacement along the edges of the Rift Valley, accompanied by a lateral displacement within it, shape the surrounding landscape. Steep cliffs line the sea east and west, while gentle slopes approach it from the north and south. The eastern sandstone escarpment towers 1,000 meters above the lake and plunges abruptly into the water. Consequently, there is no continuous land passage along the eastern shore. On the west, the limestone cliffs are lower, only about 700 meters above the sea, and are deeply dissected by wadis draining the western highlands. Now, jutting into the southeastern corner of the lake is the outfall of the Wadi Dra, is a low-lying peninsula called the Lisan, or tongue. The Lisan is a geological formation, an upthrust of rock salt or halite, a dome that's covered with heavily eroded layers of gypsum, shale, and dolomite. On the southeastern shore is another halite dome, Jebel Uzdum, or Mount Sodom, 11 kilometers long, 1.5 kilometers wide, and about 250 meters above the sea surface, and rising owing to pressure from geological forces below. It's riddled with caves where runoff from rare rainstorms have dissolved veins of salt below the rocky cap. When the sea level is around 390 meters below sea level or greater, the narrow beach at its foot leads to the Jericho Araba track into the Sebka Marsh, fringing the southern shore. Now, this marsh is now dried up. The prominence of Jebel Uzdum and its proximity to the putative location of Sodom and Gomorrah suggests here may be the inspiration for the pillar of salt said to have been the fate of Lot's wife. Now, the Dead Sea is notably associated with the story of Lot, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This text suggests that the doomed cities are located on the lake's southeastern shore, and there their ruins have been sought so far in vain. The presence in this vicinity of an early Bronze Age archaeological sites of Babedra and Mera, which were abandoned at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, that is around 2000, may have given rise to later legends of ancient cities obliterated by divine wrath. Now, whatever the biblical story's origins, Byzantines later memorialized it in the 7th century AD church of and monastery of St. Lot, perched on the crags overlooking the southeastern Dead Sea. The archaeological site there in Arata, has been memorialized with a museum at the lowest point on Earth, about which more in due course. Written accounts of the Dead Sea of any date have tended to emphasize the region's extremes: extreme isolation, extreme temperature, extreme dryness, and the extreme saltiness of its waters. Such a stricken landscape could readily be imagined as the setting for the divinely ordained destruction visited on Sodom and Gomorrah. By all appearances, it is a land still under curse. But barren though it may be, the land around the Dead Sea was and still is a source of wealth. Riches arose from the asphalt seeps and the salt pans, from plantations of balsam and dates, and later sugarcane and indigo, and now from the industrial evaporation plants yielding potash, magnesium, and bromine from the hypersaline waters. Where fresh water is available, as at Engedi and around Gordosafi on the southeastern coast, the subtropical climate made land within reach of irrigation extremely productive. Now, the steep cliffs flanking the Dead Sea were obstacles to overland travel, yet the lake itself was navigable. Periodic high waters that drowned the coastal roads and inundated the Lisan forced Dead Sea travelers into boats. So the Dead Sea, like all seas, carried its share of seafaring traffic. But unlike those other seas, it has yielded up very little direct evidence of that traffic. No shipwrecks, no sunken cargoes, only sparse remains of ports around its shores. There is, however, ample indirect evidence for the Dead Sea seafaring stretching back some 5,000 years from the 20th century AD to the 3rd millennium BC. The evidence is widely assorted. There are written accounts of Dead Sea shipping in Greek, Latin, and Arabic. There are pictures of Dead Sea ships and ancient mosaics on 19th century photographs. There is proxy data on ceramic parallels between archaeological sites on opposite sides of the sea. There's a sequence of lake levels derived from geological and geomorphological observations. The physical evidence of seacraft is scant. Ancient anchors revealed by receding Dead Sea waters and the remnants of harbor works along its shore are all that exist. Traces of the boats themselves have disappeared. And these now vanished Dead Sea ships were not fishing boats, but freighters and passenger ferries. Beyond this distinction, the design, rigging, capacities of these ancient Dead Sea ships can only be guessed at. What they carried, apart from people and such predictable products as bitumen and salt, is a matter of conjecture. Perhaps agricultural produce, perhaps smelted copper, perhaps pottery, perhaps all three, and much else beside. Also conjectural of the directions of travel and the ultimate destinations of these passengers and goods. The human interests served by the Dead Sea shipping and the inauguration, disappearance, and revival of this traffic over millennia have as much to do with the changing political and economic conditions in the highlands east and west as with the changing levels of the sea itself. These two elements, the political and economic integration of the western and eastern shores, sides of the Dead Sea, and significant changes in the Dead Sea levels over long periods of time, which have made land travel around the lake more or less practicable, are the main factors that promoted or prevented the development of shipping on the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea supports no fishery. Its waters are too salty. No one's fishing, no one's down there messing around in boats, which otherwise would be conveniently at hand for a trip now and then to the opposite shore. If you want boats at the Dead Sea, you must bring them there yourself, along with the crews to sail them. The most elaborate and elaborately described effort to bring ships and sailors to the Dead Sea was made by Lieutenant Francis Lynch of the US Navy, who in 1848 led an expedition of specially built metal hull boats down the Jordan River from Lake Galilee to the Dead Sea. The boats were manufactured in America, transported to Acre, and hauled overland to Tiberias, where the explorers put in. From Tiberias, they rowed down the Jordan River and entered the Dead Sea. With aneroid barometer and sounding lead, Lynch established by measurement what everyone had long suspected, that the Dead Sea was the lowest body of water on Earth, well below the levels of the oceans, and not amenable to be made part of a waterway linking the Mediterranean and Red Seas, a Med-Red via the Dead Canal, if you will. You can see from this slide the relative levels of those bodies of water and how the theoretical canal could not have worked. Now, Lynch does not specifically mention encountering other boats on the Dead Sea in his 1848 expedition. That some sort of regular traffic developed over the next century is developed by a dramatic account of the 19th century Dead Sea journey recorded by an English missionary, Archibald Forder. In 1895, Forder traveled from Jerusalem to Karak with his wife and newborn. This involved an overnight boat trip from the port of Jericho, port of Karak. By this route, the journey to Karak could be shortened by 3 days and was far less fatiguing. True, ordinarily, save for the mishap that occurred. Leaving Jericho after dark, before midnight, the boat had grounded firmly on a submerged bar in the southeastern end of the sea, laden not only with passengers, but also with iron girders and timbers for the government in Karak. The craft heeled over. The passengers and crew were drenched by waves driven by a strong northerly wind. Fortunately, the shipwreck occurred in only chest-deep waters close to land. By daylight, the sodden passengers and their baggage waded or were carried ashore. The boat was eventually refloated, but only after the iron and timber destined for Karak were thrown overboard. Well, this is not typical of the safety record of the Dead Sea Boat Service. In fact, the implication of Forder's account is that travel from Jericho to Karak by sea was routine and routinely safe for passengers and goods. In the spring of 1908, the first motorboat was launched on the Dead Sea. This came about at the initiative of Jalal Alimi, a Jerusalem Effendi who wanted to establish commercial communications and a regular postal service between Jerusalem and Karak via the Dead Sea. The Ottoman government authorized the undertaking in hopes of exploiting the natural resources of the Dead Sea region. A certain Père Jossin, an archaeologist at the French École Biblique, whose advice Alimi had sought on the matter, was invited by Said Effendi, then a representative of Jerusalem in the Turkish parliament, to take part in the trial crossing. Jossin immediately saw the advantages of this mode of transport for archaeological exploration of the Dead Sea, and shortly thereafter organized a study cruise for his colleagues at the École over the New Year's week, 1908-1909. By comparison, when the American archaeologist W.F. Albright led the first expedition to Bab el-Mandeb in 1924 on the eastern shore, he went the long way around, by Ford car from Jerusalem to Amman to Karak, and then down to the sea on donkeys, taking far more than the 3 extra days estimated by Ford. Now, at the outbreak of World War I, shipping on the Dead Sea joined the Ottoman war effort. Additional vessels were moved overland from Jerusalem. These were crewed by boatmen conscripted from Jaffa, who brought their seafaring skills to the naval base at Jericho in the harbor at nearby Rujum el-Bakr. We know these details from the memoirs of one Wasif Jaharaway, a young Jerusalem Arab, age 19, who in 1916 was drafted into the Ottoman Navy. Jaharaway, a musician and a landlubber, was made a clerk in charge of weighing grain purchased from the local producers around Karak and transshipped over the Dead Sea to Jerusalem. Much later, he reminisced that at Jericho during the war, he spent his days as a grain soldier and his nights as an oud officer, entertaining the Turkish naval officers and their mistresses. Now, Allenby's capture of Jerusalem in December 1917 ended Jaharaway's short naval career. And shortly after that, the Arab army sank the Ottoman Navy altogether. In February 1918, Sharif Abdullah al-Faiz and Hamoud as-Sufi, raiding northward from their base at Garandel in the Arava, attacked Mezra, the southern terminus of the barge route in the northern bight of the Lisan. They captured 60 prisoners and 10 tons of grain, destroyed a motor launch, and 6 barges. As is the case in the Dead Sea Navy, the Ottoman government, which nominally controlled both sides of the rift, had an interest, indeed a direct role, in organizing wartime shipping on the Dead Sea. And the necessity of the desirability of such shipping depended in part on the available alternatives. Before the 20th century, those alternatives were exclusively land tracks around the shore. Owing to the steep declivities that surround it, moving overland around the Dead Sea is challenging. Moreover, anything carried on a boat would have to be unloaded and repacked on animals at the water's edge. Well, the ability to move overland around the Dead Sea is limited by the topography of the shoreline. The width of the Dead Sea coast varies. It's wider or narrow in given places, non-existent in others, as it was recently along the East Coast. Depending on local conditions on the coastal plain, small changes in Dead Sea levels could expose or inundate these shoreline tracks. The foot of Jebel Uzdum is particularly sensitive in this regard, as is the stretch between Ein Feshka and Gedi. In other spots, like the original southern end of the sea, local marshiness also limited passage. Père Jossin, already well acquainted with the region from his pre-war explorations by motorboat, contributed information on land routes around the Dead Sea to the Arab Bulletin, a World War I intelligence brief compiled in Cairo by the Arab Bureau. And he wrote, and I'll quote, "From Ein Feshka to Ein Gedi, the west coast of the Dead Sea offers no sort of thoroughfare, not even a mule track. There is no long stretch of beach along which animals can move, and between such stretches as do exist, there are a succession of cliffs or steep hillsides running sheer to the water. After Jebel Uzdum, the pass through which the track runs before entering the Gore is difficult, as it runs some distance through a rock cutting only 8 or 9 feet wide. The Gore is impossible for animals in the winter, owing not only to the depth of the marshes, but also the extreme slipperiness of the surface. To cross from southwest to southeast side of the lake in winter, a detour is necessary following the southern edge of the Gore. In April 1895, some years before that war, Gray Hill, the English traveler, going from Karak to Jerusalem along this very route, encountered all of these difficulties and more. Now, the steep cliffs and narrow tracks flanking the Dead Sea presented obstacles to overland travel. Yet, regardless of the sea's level, the lake itself remained navigable. Periodic high waters that drowned coastal roads and inundated the Lisan Ford forced Dead Sea travelers into boats. You can see from this chart how the level has varied over millennia and how high waters have often corresponded with those periods in which we know have some clues about Dead Sea shipping. Around 1100 AD, when the Crusaders controlled Ultra Jordan or Transjordan, shipping on the Dead Sea flourished, according to the Crusader chronicler William of Tyre. Small ships on the Dead Sea carrying whatever may be of use to men, barley, wheat, oil, wine, dates, refined sugar, bitumen, and salt, from Karak and Zukar to Jericho. The Frankish state also taxed sea transit trade. The contemporary Arabic geographer Idrisi gives us substantially the same report, so perhaps the Crusaders took over a pre-existing enterprise. An earlier Arab geographer, Muqaddasi, writing in the late 10th century, compared the commerce at Zukar favorably to that at Basra, the port of Baghdad, despite the fact that the waters of the Dead Sea town were hot, as though the place stood over hellfire itself. Hellfire is in Arabic, Saka. Complementing these texts is a remarkable bit of archaeological evidence. Receding waters on the western Dead Sea shore expose the remains of a ship's anchor lost overboard from a ship of that era. It gives context to the otherwise extraordinary account of surprise amphibious assault on Islamic Isla from the Frankish forces at Karak. In January 1183, Renaud de Chatillon, the lord of Karak, built 5 boats and transported them overland to the Dead Sea, from the Dead Sea to the Red Sea. With these ships, Renaud besieged Isla at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba and the nearby Ile de Grès, and raided merchant and Hajj pilgrim shipping along the Red Sea and coastal towns as far south as Adiab on Egypt's eastern Red Sea coast until it was suppressed by the Egyptian Navy. Now, this Frankish flotilla was probably built and crewed by Dead Sea sailors and transported down the Arabah in the same manner used by Lieutenant Lynch and the Ottoman Navy much later. There is nothing comparable for the much earlier Nabatean era. Only Diodorus' account of a Nabatean naval victory over Antigonus to secure control of the bitumen trade in the Dead Sea, which includes a description of Nabatean reed boats, of which no traces remain. What is known of late Roman and Byzantine land routes suggests that the roads that existed were secondary and unimproved. There is no evidence, even during the low waters of the Dead Sea, sometime in the Roman period, that the Lisan Ford was ever incorporated into the formal network of Roman roads. There are remains, however, of Dead Sea ships of this period. The receding shoreline has exposed at Ein Gedi 2 anchors lying where they were dropped overboard in antiquity. One, a 2-armed anchor, composite of jujube wood, copper, iron, and lead, and the metal is completely corroded, dates to the late Hellenistic and early Roman. This dating suggests it might have been connected with the shipping around the Hasmonean port of Khirbet Mazin and the outfall of Wadi Kidron on the western shore, or with Herod's building projects around the Dead Sea, including the harbor at Zara on the eastern shore, that allowed him to travel in relative comfort by ship to the medicinal springs in Karilo. The much later mosaic map, part of a floor of a 6th century Byzantine church at Madaba, vividly illustrates Dead Sea shipping of that era. 2 ships are shown, each manned by a crew of 2, each laden with some bulk cargo. The human forms are blotted out by later Muslim or Christian iconoclasts, but the representation is quite clear. What's unclear are the course of the vessels and their intended landfall. Perhaps they sailed the same Jericho-Karak route mentioned by Idrisi or William of Tyre and used by the Ottoman Dead Sea Navy. Now, there are no texts or pictures to suggest the existence of much earlier Dead Sea shipping, say in the 3rd millennium. But to me, as an archaeologist, there are striking parallels between the early Bronze Age Jericho and early Bronze Age Bab edh-Dhra. This is an inside hello to the late Tom Schaub. Many of the parallels are necked jars, closed forms possibly suitable for transport, Early Bronze Age pottery is notoriously fragile, especially flat-bottom forms. But if these jugs had instead stump bases, they might have survived the short sea voyages up and down the Dead Sea. And this doesn't even consider goods carried in bulk, heaped up on deck, as in the Madaba mapped ships, or in other sorts of containers, wooden crates, animal skins, woven sacks, and baskets. In this same period, Canaan was doing a roaring trade in wine and olive oil with Egypt, carried by sea, the Mediterranean, packed in sturdy, very recognizable Canaanite jars. There is no similar recognizable trade containers from the Dead Sea, but the early Bronze Age exchange between Jericho and Bab edh was not international, but rather regional in nature. Our current understanding of early Bronze Age society in the Jordan Rift is so limited that it's impossible even to guess what sort of political or economic relations Jericho enjoyed with Bab edh. Larger questions aside, however, if you wanted to move pots full of stuff for potters who made the pots between Jericho and Bab edh in the early Bronze Age, the quickest and easiest way was by boat. So in this light, you might think of the early Bronze Age Bab edh not simply as a sun-baked mud brick town at the outfall of a seasonal wadi, but as a seaport connecting the Karak Plateau and southeastern Dead Sea Plain with the Jordan Valley, the highlands of Canaan. Returning briefly to our own era, the Dead Sea was for a brief period at the end of World War II a node on the global network of air routes operated by the British Overseas Airways Corporation across what was then a still far-flung British Empire. Routes linking East Africa, Middle East, India, and Australia relied on flying boats. The flying boat terminus in Mandate, Palestine was at Kalia, previously a resort in the northeastern corner of the Dead Sea in the vicinity of Rujum al-Baka. The windup of the Palestine Mandate put an end to that. Up to now, I've relied on written text, images, artifacts, ancient and more recent. I've not cited the personal testimony of any living Dead Sea sailor, but I'll conclude with one. In December 1965 to January 1966, a British archaeological team directed by Mr. Ian Blake of Oxford University excavated at a series of sites along the western shore of the Dead Sea between Qumran and Engedi. In those days, that part of the Dead Sea region was under Jordanian administration, and the Jordanian government provided logistical support for the expedition in the form of landing craft to ferry gear to and from the expedition camp. I learned of this from someone who had been a student member of that team, Miss Kay Wright. By the time we met, however, in 1987, she was Dr. Kay Prague and was directing a project of her own, one of several in Jordan. In a recent email exchange with her, I learned that Dr. Blake may be attending today's webinar, so I hope I have my facts straight. For details and images given here, I've relied almost completely on the Illustrated London News of March 4th, 1967, and its report on the Dead Sea sites in the utter wilderness. In closing, let me emphasize that the Dead Sea should not be regarded as an uncrossable barrier. For all its remoteness, the Dead Sea has, for much of its human history, functioned as a thoroughfare. Despite its perceived isolation and manifest barrenness, the land around it has been inhabited since the sea was formed 12,000 years ago. Traveling on or around it has always carried certain risks from extreme climate, extreme rising and falling of lake levels, from earthquakes along the rift's active fault lines. Nonetheless, that fitful continuity of habitation along its shores and of the seafaring on its waters demonstrate the enduring, if paradoxical, appeal of this unique lake. Now, for an even better understanding, I recommend a visit to the museum at the lowest place on Earth in Gordes Safi on the southeastern corner of the Dead Sea. If you're able to go, you will find it worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Joe. I do look forward to visiting that museum at the lowest place of the earth and having a nice soak in the fabulous waters of the Dead Sea. We've got a number of questions here waiting for you, and they seem to fall into several categories. And one is about usage. There are questions on climate change, and there are some political questions. I'd like to start with the questions on usage. And this is from our mutual friend, Dr. Joshua Weiss. What do you see as the role of the Dead Sea in the future?
Good as me. That is going to have to follow larger questions of political settlement. In and of itself, it is simply a feature on the landscape, just like the Jordan Valley and the Wadi Araba. And although research of various sorts can take place on opposite sides, this is a unitary landform. It would be much better if that research could be pursued in a unitary manner.
Yes, there's a lot of woulda couldas that we appreciate here. But Here's a question, follow on from Josh, which is, do you see any potential uses of the sea that has not yet occurred to us, or have you noted anything in your studies?
Well, because of the evolution of modes of transportation, as a means of carrying goods and people back and forth, it's probably not going to recover its former glory. But it has, just by reason of its environment, attracted a lot of resort traffic. It always did that. But one could imagine, as with Père Jossin, a circumnavigation of the shores of the Dead Sea, east and west. That would be rather fun.
That would be a terrific tour to take. Yes, indeed. Konstantinos Politis writes, the late 19th century Ottomans had a regular postal route, postal boat service from Jerusalem to Karak via their port at Haditha. Presumably this is the same as the Mezra'a you mentioned?
Yes. Yes, there is much more information, especially about these 19th century connections, scattered through primarily written references, and deserves a study in and of itself.
Konstantinos also writes, there was an Ottoman fort at Al-Haditha, which was attacked by Lawrence and his Bedouins, they say, from the Lisan Peninsula.
The attacks of the Arab irregulars on various Ottoman strongholds on the west side, in the east side of the valley, were more in the nature of guerrilla operations. This raid up the Dead Sea, up the Arava, which actually destroyed the terminus of the barge traffic, was the more significant. And Lawrence mentions that in his own account of his activities in the war.
This is a question that I actually have. You mentioned that the Med-Dead-Red Canal was not going to work, but there was talk when I lived in Jordan of a Red to Dead Sea Canal. Do you think that's something that's possible? And I know this is maybe outside the archaeology department.
There's actually been a certain amount of engineering study about the practicality of this. There's still grave reservations on the environmental side. No one knows exactly what would happen if you were to introduce large quantities of Red Sea seawater into the waters of the Dead Sea. There are further questions about whether it is really economically feasible to pump that water all that way into the Dead Sea, even if you could recover some of the energy through hydroelectric installations. And then, of course, there's, as with any manipulation of water within the Dead Sea Rift or within the Jordan Rift, there are the political situation of the riparians, the Israel, Palestinians, and Jordan. But the region itself is slowly starving of water, and there needs to be a solution. This isn't necessarily a solution for the lack of water, although there was some aspect of this Red Dead Canal that was going to involve desalination using water generated from hydropower. But I'm aware that there was a lot of noise about this 10 years ago. It's been very, very quiet since then.
We have a question from Oliver Pospisil, which is, what will the Dead Sea look like in 2050 or 2100, in the next century, given the climate crisis?
The safer way to add more water to the Dead Sea would be to cease to take water out of the tributaries that feed it from the Jordan Valley. But this encounters the problem of the general regional lack of water altogether. And this is in turn aggravated by global climate change, which is reducing rainfall. So as for predictions, that's for a geomorphologist or a geologist or a climate scientist to make. I can only look at the past and say how it has been in the past. But in the past, human interventions have had relatively lesser impact than natural climate processes. And now we're at a point where human anthropogenic climate change is overtaking natural processes.
We saw that in the chart you showed, which is sort of post World War I, post World War II, at the far left-hand side part.
There has been a dramatic drop in the overall level of the sea, and this is largely due to the offtake of what had been tributary waters from on both sides of the Jordan Valley. So that water is being captured for irrigation. It's being impounded by dams, and inevitably the rain gauge is going to have less water in it.
Is the Dead Sea unique in its composition, or are there any other seas that are similar to you?
There are other hypersaline lakes around the world. I'm not an expert in all of them. I do note that they exist. Their genesis is often from different sorts of circumstances that have created the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea, as I pointed out, is a part of a much larger geological system that has a particular history of its own. I'll just mention as a personal aside, now I'm living now in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The Rio Grande River, which rises in the southern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in southern Colorado, flows the length of the state in a rift valley. So there is a rift valley that contains the Rio Grande River. The difference is that there's no terminal basin, and that the bed of the river is well above sea level, not quite a mile. And it flows through this rift valley as far south as the southern border around El Paso. It turns east, forms the border between Texas and the states of Mexico. Is geologically similar, but it did not form the kind of hypersaline terminal basin that we find in the Dead Sea.
So Herr Ghanim is curious to know, what are the ecological implications of the degradation of the Dead Sea, and how can it be saved?
Well, the changes in the Dead Sea region over that period of human history, from the early 20th century, say, and back, human technology had fewer means of coping with those challenges. Now, technology tends to be applied first without thinking about the long-term impacts, like this Red Dead Canal. So we don't know what the engineers are going to come up with. What the engineers come up with may depend on what the politicians come up with in terms of settling a long-standing conflict over the control of the region.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see when it occurs to politicians anywhere that their decisions may be irrelevant if we don't settle the problems and address the problems of climate change. We don't have an Earth, we don't have a playground to play on, or a battlefield. Alix Hopkins asks this question. She says, I find it ironic that at one end, raw sewage may flow into the sea in certain spots, and at the other end, minerals are extracted, in part to make beauty products. There's not so much mention of this, and she wonders about that.
I only had 45 minutes. The other thing, there is, of course, not only the problem of inputs into the sea, which are sometimes uncontrolled, but also, and not just industrial waste, but also agricultural waste, which contain artificial fertilizers. And this is the problem of the dissolution of artificial fertilizers entering a water system is a problem not just in the Dead Sea Basin, but globally. And the attention to environmental matters tends to take a backseat to other economic, political ones. And one thing I was unable to touch on at all is how the Rift Valley forms part of an important avian flyway from Europe to Africa, and not just in the rift itself, but on either side, and the degradation of marshlands because they're drained or because there's less water available has an impact on that part of the ecology, which almost isn't noticed. And this has been true, of course, going back to the era of the formation of the sea itself, back into, in human terms, late prehistory.
So these are some, what I'm understanding here is that some of these issues are long-term and not necessarily the finger pointing at the second half of the 20th century, but we have had an enormous impact.
I mean, as with the global environmental crisis worldwide, there has been incremental change, incremental interventions based on technology and environments where the long-term impacts were not realized or not noticed. And that's what I find in archaeology, one of the useful things, socially useful things, is that there is a lot of ancient environmental data embedded in those archaeological remains. And if we paid attention to them, we could see what would happen to a sea that sinks to a certain level. That's not probably going to cause the termination of the industrial production of chemicals, of minerals in the southern basin of the Dead Sea and suddenly see it refill. But it is a cautionary tale.
What moved you most personally when you were working at the Dead Sea and studying it?
That I have to reflect on that a bit, because it is such an unusual landscape, and it's one that's difficult to take in from any single perspective. It's something you have to spend some time with. And so I've been able to do that. And these questions about, well, what's it like to sail on the sea, are the kinds of things that occur to me as a research question that sends me off looking for answers to those questions. And it's never a search that's going to end. So I can't say, this is the one thing I found and that's it. No, but that's generally true in archaeology, not just of the Dead Sea.
Of the stories you told us of the U.S. naval officer and so on, any of those adventures inspire you in a particular way?
Well, I as with all things archaeologists study, gosh, I wish I'd have been there when it happened. I would have signed on with Lynch's expedition just to be able to see this landscape in a more pristine form, not in a pristine form, because it has been transformed by human occupation for millennia. I mean, it would be fun to visit the Dead Sea port of Bab el-Mandeb in the third millennium.
Well, you've moved our imaginations, certainly, with this conversation. And I have been lucky to visit the Dead Sea numerous times. I can imagine it differently now, more active and more vital than just a spot to go and put mud on oneself and bake a little bit. How deep is the Dead Sea? Do we know that?
just offhand, it's about 400 meters below the surface is the deepest part of the sea floor. But as you saw from that bathymetric rendering, it's much more shallow on the western side. That's why the recession of the sea has been much more noticeable on that side of the ocean rather than on the east side, where the cliffs plunged almost down to that 400-meter mark. And as I alluded, because of the nature, the physical nature of the sea, shipwrecks on the Dead Sea don't sink, they float. And whatever wood was left over from a wrecked ship was repurposed almost immediately because there's no other wood down there either, for firewood or housing or what have you. So there are I've seen photographs of a few relic metal boats rusted to disuse. But what has been so striking in the recent recession of the western shore has been these anchors, which obviously were lost overboard. No one went down to retrieve them, of many different periods. So there may be more of these to be found.
Thank you. We will leave you this day with a montage of some other archaeological spots in Southwest Asia. Perhaps you've been to some of them. On behalf of all of us at the Abraham Path Initiative, I'm Anisa Mehdi, and we thank you, Joe Greene, and all of you for joining us.
Thank you very much.